Richard Engel, who is in the outskirts of Kyiv. And Richard, clearly the story is this Ukrainian resistance and Russia's inability to, I think, to have a quick invasion and success here in Ukraine. What are you seeing?
We are seeing that the Ukrainians are not only putting up a heavy fight, they are pulling together. We are on the outskirts of Kiev right now, and as we've been driving through towns and villages, we are seeing Ukrainians coming out, manning checkpoints, taking their hunting rifles, shotguns, standing next to Ukrainian troops. People had thought that by now the Ukrainian army may have to go underground. We are seeing many, many Ukrainian armored vehicles, tanks on the road. They are operating openly. They are cutting down signs by the roadside in an attempt to confuse advancing Russian troops. And according to the numbers coming out from the Ukrainian military, they believe that they have destroyed over 700 Russian armored vehicles, 150 Russian tanks, about 50 aircraft, helicopters, and fixed wings, and inflicted about 4,000 Russian casualties, Russian fatalities. And there are numerous reports of Russian troops simply running out of fuel, breaking down by the roadside, and being detained, in some cases, by average Ukrainians who are handing them over to police, handing them over to authorities. So they are fighting back very hard.
And Richard, I'm just curious, we're seeing, while the Russian military is having success at cutting Ukraine off from ports and things like this, it's this fighting in the cities. They haven't gotten control of any city yet. It's clear that in order to do this, they may have to get bloodier. Have you seen any evidence that more Russian troops are coming?
Well, what we've been hearing is that the Russians have so far mobilized about half of the troops that they had positioned around the edges of Ukraine. And just earlier today, some Russian elements pushed into the city of Kharkiv, which has about 1.5 million people in it. And the Russian troops did get out of their vehicles, which is one of the first times we've seen that, and tried to occupy part of the city. But they were pushed back, and there was heavy fighting. And according to Ukrainian officials and videos that we've been seeing, the Russian troops were repelled from the city. So they haven't captured the capital. They haven't captured even other smaller major cities. So, yes, if they want to take the cities, they're going to have to get out of their cars. They're going to have to go house to house. And so far, they haven't even been able to establish and maintain a foothold in any major population.
And joining me now is the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Ambassador, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Over the last 72 hours, we've seen almost a daily escalation in sanctions from the Western Alliance, whether sometimes led by the United States. Obviously, Europeans have a lot to say about the SWIFT system. And I guess my first question is, why has it been sort of this daily escalation? Why couldn't we have gotten all of this done on Thursday? Why has it taken till yesterday? And even that, we only have a partial removal of the Russian banks from the SWIFT system.
Chuck, you know, we made clear from the beginning that we will escalate as the Russians escalate. And that's exactly what we have done. The president, in all of his announcements before, indicated that we will be prepared to put harsh sanctions on the Russians. They were aware that those sanctions were coming. And we have been consistent in applying those sanctions as we've seen the escalation by the Russians, in coordination, of course, with all of our European colleagues.
Are we at all going to get the Germans and the Italians to agree to go full bore here? I know they're worried about energy. Is there any way to change that?
You know, I can't speak for either the German or Italian governments here, but I can tell you that the president has been working very, very closely with his counterparts in both of these countries. He's spoken, as you know, to the Germans, and we've engaged very closely with the Germans on this, and we're unified in our approach to the Germans. So I can just say that we are continuing to assess what we can do moving forward. Yeah. And the Russians can be assured that we will continue to put more and more sanctions as they continue to press more on the Ukrainian government.
When we were first announcing sanctions, we were told it was about deterrence. I want to play a few clips here from various officials.
The president believes that sanctions are intended to deter.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence.
The sanctions are designed in the first instance to try to deter Russia from taking further aggression.
And then President Biden admitted this.
No one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening.
So I guess the question is, how does this end now? Meaning we've got the sanctions did not deter. We've put in pretty harsh sanctions. We've gone through how it could be slightly harsher. But can this end with sanctions alone?
Look, Chuck, we've been very clear-eyed on this from the beginning. As the president noted, we were going to apply harsh sanctions. And initially, they were an attempt to prevent Russia from taking this aggressive action. But it is Vladimir Putin's decision on whether he will stop what he's doing and listen to the voices of the world, the voices that have condemned him, or he will continue. And if he continues, we will continue to apply sanctions. But at the same time, we were preparing for just this action. And the president has approved moving more troops to support our NATO colleagues. We provided additional support to the Ukrainian government just over the past few days, close to $1 billion and billions since this all started. So we're clear-eyed. This has been a two-pronged approach. We hope that the Russians would listen to the pressure that we were putting them under, but they didn't. So they have to continue to feel additional sanctions and additional pressures on their economy, and they will feel the pain.
President Zelensky called on Russia to be removed from the United Nations. You and I were talking beforehand. We know there's a charter. That is not something that can just be done with a vote or anything like this. But it is sort of odd that Russia's currently in charge of the council right now. It's a rotation. I get how that works. And the world is trying to condemn Russia, and it looks like the UN is just sort of feckless at this. How can the UN play a critical role here?
I would absolutely disagree with your characterization that this is feckless. We have had 3 meetings in the Security Council, and just this week, on Friday alone, we put forward a resolution in which 81 countries co-sponsored with us. 44 of them stood at the podium with me. So we're not being feckless. Russia is hearing a very unified voice from the Security Council, and it has to be very uncomfortable for them. They are a member of the Security Council, and until Monday, they will be president of the Security Council. As you noted, it's rotational, but they can't prevent the Security Council from taking actions. And we have taken some very strong actions since this started.
Do you expect another vote to try to condemn what Russia's doing? I know there's been some talk of that. And if so, do you think this time India, UAE, some others will get on board?
Well, we're going to have a meeting, another emergency meeting of the Security Council today, in which we will make a decision to call for an emergency session of the General Assembly, which we plan to have on Monday. And then hopefully later in the week, we will have a vote, possibly as early as Wednesday, on a General Assembly resolution that the Russians cannot veto.
I go back to, is there any penalty, any mechanism at all to penalize the Russians' behavior at the United Nations? Is there anything?
We can isolate them. We can isolate them in the United Nations. We can isolate them in UN specialized agencies. They are feeling that isolation. There will be a meeting in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council where they again will be called out and their aggressions will be brought to the attention of the world. So again, we have a number of tools to put pressure on the Russians, and we're using all of those tools.
All right, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, really appreciate you coming on, sharing the administration's perspective. Let's hope this works.
Thank you.
And now we have the rare opportunity of having a Democratic and Republican senator join us together. Democrat Mark Warner, he's chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Republican Rob Portman, he sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The two senators actually traveled together to Munich late last week. So senators, welcome back to Meet the Press. Got a couple of pieces of news that have trickled out literally in the last few minutes. Senator Portman, let me start with the news that President Zelensky has agreed to send a delegation to meet with a Russian delegation on the border of Ukraine and Belarus. Obviously, we're always going to be pro-diplomacy if diplomacy can work here. Any advice to the Ukrainians on how to manage these negotiations?
I think Ukrainians know how to do it, and they also know to be distrustful of whatever the Russians say, since everything that Vladimir Putin has said and other Russian officials has been propaganda, disinformation. So they need to be careful. And by the way, Belarus is where the Russians wanted to have the meeting. Belarus is now under control of Russia, and Belarus is aiding and abetting the Russians' attack on their neighbor Ukraine. So it's outrageous. Let me say, Chuck, at the outset, our hearts go out to the Ukrainian people today. I mean, this is something where the American people are standing firmly with Ukraine. There are over 40 rallies around the country today in support of Ukraine. I'll be at one in Cleveland, Ohio this afternoon. But around the world you see this, including in Russia. The world's standing up in ways that, frankly, I haven't seen this kind of unity since 9/11. And I think that is something that will, in the end, be very helpful. But we've got to provide more military assistance. We've got to tighten up these sanctions further. By the way, in your conversation with the ambassador, you talked about how sanctions did not deter. That's because tough sanctions were not put in place. So we could have and should have done more. And many of us were calling for that. But we are where we are now, so we need to continue to tighten it up, including putting all Russian banks under this SWIFT ban.
Senator Warner, the other piece of news today is Vladimir Putin has, it's a bit of a saber rattle here, ordered his Russian nuclear deterrent forces on alert. How should the United States respond to that?
Well, first of all, the United States response has been stronger because we've actually brought all our European and other allies along with us. Rob and I were in Munich last week. The Europeans were believing, but and mostly in, but not fully in. But look at what's happened over the last few days. We've got Nord Stream 2 sanctions. We've personally sanctioned Putin. He now joins that group of like Gaddafi and Assad, of one of the few world leaders ever been personally sanctioned. We have the SWIFT actions, because if we'd sanctioned SWIFT, that's a European organization. The fact that SWIFT is acting in concert with us, kicking Russian banks out. And you're seeing even former Russian allies like Kazakhstan, where Putin sent troops recently, refused to back Putin. I think Putin totally underestimated both the Ukrainians' fight, and I want to echo what Rob said, that we have great respect for Zelensky rallying the nation and this worldwide support for the Ukrainians. I think he underestimated Ukrainians' resolve. So far, thank God, he's not thrown everything. He's not thrown the cyber attacks the way we expected. But these are very dangerous days. And one last point, remarkably, what he's also been able to do is unify the vast majority of us in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans alike.
Which has been quite difficult lately.
We're with the Ukrainian people, we're with NATO, and he's going to pay a high price.
I got to ask you about something that the ranking member in your Intel committee tweeted overnight, tweeted on Friday night, Marco Rubio. He said this, Senator Warner: "I wish I could share more, but for now I can say it's pretty obvious to many that something is off with Putin. He has always been a killer, but his problem now is different and significant. It would be a mistake to assume that Putin would react the same way he would have 5 years ago." This is an open question. Is Putin a rational actor? What does our intelligence folks tell you?
Chuck, Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I'm not going to comment on any specific intelligence. But what we do know is that over the last couple of years, Putin has been more and more isolated. He's not been in the Kremlin for the most part. He's been down at his place in Sochi or at his dacha outside of Moscow. And when you are an authoritarian leader and you have less and less inputs, and you're only hearing from people that want to say to the boss, hey, you're right, I think that leads to miscalculation. And I think that is what has happened in the case of his invasion in Ukraine.
Senator Portman, he went into Ukraine. He did not go into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Those three are NATO countries. Ukraine was not. In hindsight, should we have brought Ukraine into the NATO alliance?
Yes, and I think that's a very important point to make. Even now, Chuck, we should be allowing Ukraine, and by the way, allowing other countries that may want to come forward. Georgia is one. I'm told that Finland and Sweden may be two others at some point. We should allow them to come into NATO. There's a process called the MAP process, which is basically a roadmap to get into NATO. Many of us have been calling for NATO to allow Ukraine to go down that path. We should have done it. If we had done it, I don't think that we would be in the situation we're in now. And I think, other people said the opposite. They said, well, if we allow them into NATO, this will make Russia mad. Well, you know what? Here they are
anyway
with this atrocity in Ukraine, killing already hundreds of Ukrainians, wounding thousands of them. Unprecedented since World War II to have one country invade another country's borders. And if NATO were there, I don't think he'd be doing it. Assuming that NATO, would respond, which I'm seeing. I agree with what Mark just said, is that Putin miscalculated. He thought this would divide NATO. In fact, it has strengthened NATO and brought us together in ways we haven't seen in years.
In fact, was it a mistake for President Biden, Senator Warner, to rule out any troops in Ukraine for this reason? We've always had a policy of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan. Make China not sure what we're going to do. Should we have done the same?
I don't think the American public, or for that matter, our NATO allies, would have been wanting American or NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. I do think I think the administration, I criticize them many times, but NATO a year ago was broken in the aftermath of President Trump. Even 4 months ago, NATO, other than us and the British, the rest of the NATO nations were not fully bought into this threat. They are fully bought in at this point, and I think you're going to see, I still worry about, for example, one of the things we talked about off air, if Putin launches his full cyber capabilities, shuts down the power in Ukraine, does that somehow shut down the power in eastern Poland as well? Because once you let malware out, could that shut off Polish hospitals?
How do you feel about this idea that Article 5 could be invoked on a cyber attack?
Cyber attack is, again, one of those areas where we've had so-called strategic ambiguity. But if you suddenly see American troops get hurt because the power's been shut off, or Polish citizens die because the hospitals go down, you're very rapidly approaching what I think is an Article 5 violation.
By the way, are you also open to NATO expansion?
I'm open to NATO expansion, but that
are you ready to put Ukraine in now at this point, or at least after this is over?
That actually has to be done in concert with all 30 NATO nations.
Yeah.
There is a process, and I think the administration, and frankly, NATO was right by not, during Putin's pressure campaign, to somehow say we should take away that right of Ukraine to have that opportunity to join NATO.
All right. Senator Portman, I'm going to change the subject for one quick subject. There's a Supreme Court nominee. I don't think this is going to be a very contentious hearing, but I'm curious, what would it take for you to vote to confirm her?
Well, I'm going to look at her record and look at her qualifications, as I think people will. In this case, I don't think, Chuck, it will be as partisan we've seen in the past, as we did as an example with Judge Kavanaugh when he was nominated. As you know, she'll be replacing another liberal on the court, and Democrats have 50 votes, and plus one with the vice president. They have the ability to confirm, but I think the rest of us on the Republican side are going to be looking at her record, looking at her qualifications. We don't believe you ought to legislate from the bench. We think the Supreme Court focus ought to be on protecting our rights and following the Constitution, and that's what we'll be looking for.
All right. Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio. Senator Warner, I didn't ask you about it. I assumed you're for her.
Listen, I think Judge Jackson's got great qualifications, but one thing we could do right now, back on the issue at hand,
yes.
Rob Portman and I have a bill that would require, when cyber attacks take place, that the government be notified so we can share with the private sector. You want to make us stronger and safer? Let's get that piece of legislation done this week.
All right. Well, we'll take a look at that. Senators Portman and Warner, really appreciate you coming on together, especially at a time like this. And let's hope that the folks in Ukraine will get some relief soon. Welcome back. So what options does the United States have to help Ukraine beyond sanctions and sending military equipment? What happens if the war, by accident or design, spreads to NATO countries? How likely is it that Vladimir Putin's designs end with Ukraine? We brought together 3 experts to discuss the war and its implications. Kori Schake, Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Cyber expert Clint Watts, Distinguished Research Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And from Stanford, the former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Kori, let me start with you and this. First of all, we're sending all this military aid, we're sending all this equipment to a country in the middle of a war. Just logistically, is it realistic that we're going to be able to get all these arms to the Ukrainians?
Sure, the Ukrainians are in control of most of their own borders, and taking it up to the border and handing it over to Ukrainians willing and able to fight for their country is what's already going on. Several NATO countries are already convoying military equipment to the Ukrainians.
The next step here for us in the next week or two, should we expect more troops to be sent to NATO countries in the Eastern Europe?
Well, we're sending a lot of troops to NATO countries. The NATO Reaction Force has already been sent as well. These are good things, reminding the Russians that we're prepared to defend ourselves and defend our allies is a stabilizing message right now.
Clint, we brought you here. I think there's a lot of us, and I'm curious, that are surprised we haven't seen a cyber attack against the United States yet, or against the West. What are you seeing in your research?
It's an onion, right? If you look at the core, Ukrainians under cyber attack for 8 years, and it's been intense. There are some reports of some destructive malware. You might have seen DHS CISA put out some warnings about that, so we need to ratchet up. I think this really speaks to the point about what are we going to do for cyber response. We have been delinquent on coming up with a solution on this for the last decade. And we've been talking about NATO. What is a cyber NATO? Attack on one, is it an attack on all? It's time to figure those things out so we have a unified response.
Earlier this week, there were some reports that President Biden has been given at least the options of potentially using offensive cyber capabilities against Russia. How likely is that going to happen, or was that probably designed to saber rattle Russia a little bit?
I think it's some of both. I mean, it's good to have these things in our pocket, but it's also time to set that deterrence. There are 2 aspects to this war, really 3, that Putin can use: nuclear, cyber, and disinformation, misinformation, to really put us on our heels and destabilize us. So if we can keep it limited, we can use it in scope, and we go off of specific targets. Maybe it's the military, maybe it's parts of Russia, maybe it's certain parts of the banking system to send a message. I think we need to figure out that there's something between absolute destruction of our cyberspace and not doing anything at all.
Ambassador McFaul, let's go to another way that this could end, and that is if Putin either recalculates, and maybe that's what these peace talks are about, or, as Admiral Stavridis said to me in my podcast, there's a Julius Caesar solution. What do you see right now with Putin, and do you think he's a rational actor right now?
You know, Chuck, that word rational actor is a very elastic, right? To get kicked out of SWIFT, as it happened to Russia yesterday, and then to have the president of Russia get in front of his generals and say we need to prepare for a nuclear war, that doesn't sound very rational to me. I'm nervous that Mr. Putin has been believing his propaganda for decades. Remember, this guy's been in power for 22 years. He doesn't listen to his aides. Even when I was ambassador 8 years ago, he was very dismissive of anybody around him. He's out at his compound, doesn't come into town very much, and under COVID, he's been more isolated. And if you watch and listen to him, and I met him in 1991, I've been watching him since he was prime minister in 1999. I sat in the room with him for 5 years when I worked in the Obama administration. I speak Russian, I listen to him, and I know what he says. He's increasingly unhinged in the way that he talks about the regime. Just yesterday, talking about Zelensky being a neo-Nazi. Let's remind everybody watching, he's Jewish, and a drug addict. That doesn't sound like somebody that's going to sit down and negotiate a peaceful outcome.
So if that's the case, then how do you create policy if you know he's an irrational actor?
Well, one, deterrence, of course. We need to be vigilant. This nuclear threat especially, I think we need to respond to. I would hope that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, would be calling his counterpart today, Mr. Gerasimov, to clarify exactly what he meant by those statements. Number two, I think this is about the war. You know, yeah, the sanctions are great. I support them 100%, but they take months and years to have effect. Yeah. It's really about winning the war on the ground. We need to support the Ukrainians who are fighting. And three, if he succeeds in his ultimate objective, which is regime change, and force Zelensky out of power, arrest him, or kill him, we need to continue to support the resistance. I'm convinced, Chuck, there is no way that Ukrainians will submit to some kind of puppet regime from Russia. That is not going to happen. But to unravel that could take a long time.
Look, they've twice gotten rid of puppet regimes. Corey, it's been fascinating waking up every morning, seeing Zelensky alive and thriving. And you can see the Western alliance having the same feeling going, we should do more. We should have done more. I get the sense now there's a lot of regret in Europe.
Well, all of us should have done more for the protection and defense of Ukraine. But now what Putin is trying to do, in part with this nuclear threat, is collapse Western solidarity. What he wanted was to end the post-Cold War order, and he's rejuvenated it.
NATO's never felt more relevant.
It's a delight to behold that Western countries are standing strong and squaring their shoulders together.
What do you expect our official response to be to this nuclear saber rattling by Putin?
I hope it will be the response that the French foreign minister gave, which is that we too have nuclear weapons, and we too are prepared to defend ourselves, our allies, and our interests.
Clint, should Americans expect that we're going to get attacked by the Russians? On cyber, in some form?
I think so, in some form. But I also think Americans need to learn that they can go without Netflix for an hour and we will be okay. We don't have resilience in this country around cyber. And I think the same part with the administration. We keep saying Putin is playing chess. He is not. He's playing poker. We need to call his bluff. If the Ukrainians can hold for another week, the supply lines are not there. He cannot stabilize his rear areas. We have a real chance to stop Putin in his tracks and give him a decisive loss.
We do. Well, go get him, President Zelensky. Hey, thank you guys. Really appreciate it. Mike, Corey, Clint, very much. Back panelists here, NBC News Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell, Jeremy Bash, former Chief of Staff at the Defense Department and at the CIA, Danielle Plechter of the American Enterprise Institute, and NBC News Chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker. Kristen, I'll let you kick things off here. The president overnight seemed to maybe get more European buy-in on the SWIFT after he said, he almost was dismissive of it before. What is really happening here? And is this White House disappointed that the Europeans haven't even gone further?
Well, I think that President Biden, and he said during that press conference that there were divisions among the Europeans. Behind the scenes, I'm told there was a lot of arm twisting trying to get everyone on board. And so what you saw yesterday is the Europeans come together and agree to kick certain Russian financial institutions out of the SWIFT banking institution. And I think that caught the Russians off guard, as have just about everything else that we've witnessed, the protests in the street in Russia, the fact that Zelensky has been so defiant, the fact that the Ukrainians have held them off night. They're looking to Congress to get more funding and I think more military support.
But what they really have to make is a big decision about counterinsurgency. How involved are we overtly or co-side Ukraine? There is a dispute over that. But, you know, the SWIFT, what they did on SWIFT, there's still big holes. It's Swiss cheese, really, on SWIFT, because first they have to wait for the Belgian leaders, the board of directors, to approve it next week. They've got a big cutout for any banks that are involved in it. And which banks are those? They could be some of the worst oligarch-controlled banks. So let's wait to see exactly how it's implemented.
All right. But Putin, I think he looks on his heels. Do you agree?
He looks on his heels.
Can we keep him there?
No, we can't. We are, but they've got a big military. They've got nuclear weapons. They've got enough personnel to do what they want in Ukraine. The problem is at what cost? And eventually, what are we going to do? I mean, this is the question that Andrea raises. And, you know, I do think the sanctions are a big part of this. The fact that the sanctions have all of these loopholes is a big problem. What are we doing on the Russian central bank? We're going to backfill Poland and others that are depleting their own defensive stocks in order to support the Ukrainians. None of those questions have been answered.
Central bank and stopping it from being able to support the ruble. I'm not sure that's possible to do.
And by the way, sorry, Jeremy, but do you realize that the Treasury has done nothing? I went looking all over the Treasury site to see what the rules were.
Soviets in Afghanistan, and I think this may be an opportunity for the United States' ambitions on the global stage. I think swallowing Ukraine, a country the size of Texas with 40 million people, is unprecedented since World War II. And if the United States can train and equip the Ukrainians and I think engage in a second Charlie Wilson's War, basically the sequel to the movie and the book, which is arming and training a determined force, those tanks like with can openers like the Javelins, and kill Russians, which is what our equipment's doing, I think there's a huge opportunity to hit Putin very hard.
Well, and I think that the Ukrainians' defiance has actually bought them a little bit more time and bought Washington a little bit more time to figure out exactly what they are going to do. And this is a rare moment. All of the loopholes you mentioned, Andrea, where you have Republicans and Democrats actually pretty united saying, we have to do more, looking at each other, pointing the finger and saying, let's get back to the table
you're watching the Ukrainians fight.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
Zelensky in his videos, I mean, I think of him as sort of the now president. And the question is, are they going to be crushed? Because Russia knows how to crush them if they want to. If Putin is crazy enough to take on the apartment buildings and the civilian populations and move in and move his people out of tanks. You saw the tank that went up and swallowed the car. The passenger, the driver survived. But if he's crazy, we look at these protests. The protesters are going to be crushed.
Chairman, what is our ability? Concern that Putin is crazy enough to try a tactical nuke. That's been my concern. That not full bore, but he might try something. Do we have the ability to stop this?
We have tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, Chuck. We have national missile defenses to protect the homeland. But if he fires off a nuclear weapon in Europe, that's going to be a very obviously tragic situation. And the only way to stop him there is to deter him by saying, we're going to make you pay.
Is it realistic? Is the Julius Caesar solution realistic, Danny?
The Julius Caesar solution being that someone stabs him in the rotunda? No.
I say this because if you squeeze the oligarchs hard enough, right? If you squeeze the rich elites around them, will they try to...
No, I don't think it's realistic, as much as I think highly of Jim Stavridis, who suggested that to you. Look, Bashar al-Assad is still in power. Putin is a much savvier, much more shrewd tyrant. He's not going to put anybody who might stab him in the rotunda anywhere near
He's
him.
only talking to picking to the Lavrovs and the others who have more West experience.
Kristen probably is only going to be remembered for whatever he says about Ukraine and Russia.
That right now is the key question inside the White House. I have asked if he has recast his entire speech. There are some who want him to make this State of the Union address a message that we are in a fight right now, democracies against autocracies. It's not clear that they are prepared to go that far. At this point in time, it seems the speech is still very focused on inflation.
It would be a little weird to hear the words "Build Back Better." I'll be honest.
Yes, but Chuck, here's the thing. This is a moment where foreign policy is intersecting with domestic politics. Everything that happens in Russia right now, every step that the U.S. takes impacts inflation. So the White House has to figure out how to really get that message across that the president...
I don't know if the public's listening to him right now. Whether
Well,
that's
this
fair or
is
unfair,
a
it's just
chance
fact.
for him.
All right, we're going to do a little more politics after the break here when we come back. Sanctions aren't a one-way street. We were just... Welcome back. Data download time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine this week is not just an international story. It's going to have deep impacts right here in the United States as well, particularly with our economy, which we know will impact how voters feel about the direction of the country and its leadership. You can just look, the simplest way to look at it, the Dow. Yes, it's just one index and people invest all over, but at the end of the day, this has the sort of impact on the national psyche. The Dow down some 7% since the beginning of the year. And if you look just in the last 2 weeks, it's been extraordinarily volatile. It has gone down, actually made a nice little comeback at the end of the week, but still down overall as this crisis has continued. But it's not just on stocks. The price of oil, that we've also seen climb about 24% since the start of the year. Yes, as they were building up troops around Ukraine, we kept seeing this number inch up. By the way, the president did try to get Saudi Arabia to pump some more oil. That has not happened yet. This will easily have an impact on our economy. And then there's this. You realize Russia and Ukraine account for some 1/3 of all wheat around the world. And while we don't get a lot of wheat from Ukraine, it is pushing up the price of wheat overall, which will have some sort of strain on our supply, which of course will do what? Raise the price of a local.
For too long, our government, our courts haven't looked like America. And I believe it's time that we have a court that reflects the full talents and greatness of our nation.
Andrea Mitchell, we were just talking with Kristen there at the end. It's maybe the only other thing he can accomplish at the State of the Union is introducing her again, both historical and it's going to be sort of a non-story, it feels like, in about 3 weeks.
It's going to be a non-story unless the Republicans make a critical mistake, which is to keep calling her a left-wing whatever, which she is not. She has extraordinary credentials. All three of these women did. And he made the choice of the person who had most recently been confirmed by this same Senate and also is in that court just below the Supreme Court. Decision, not as a political decision.
Right.
And she brings so much experience, so much knowledge. She's a former clerk. She has the criminal justice, defense experience. It's just such a mistake for the Republican Party.
Doesn't sound like they're going to
paint her. Well, Mitch McConnell was a little bit surprised by Lindsey Graham because it's so unusual for a senator, just 8 months after voting to confirm her for this other court, to now go against her.
Judge Jackson.
Well, this is base politics,
She's been confirmed 3 times. I mean, she's been confirmed 3. Judge Amy Coney Barrett was. I mean, she's eminently qualified. This is a no-brainer.
The most important credentials, she came from the Miami-Dade public
That's huge.
school system. I don't know who else did at this table. But Danny, it's some of for raising money purposes, and that's about it, right?
I don't think that the Republicans are going to in any meaningful way oppose her. I think the only thing that we're going to see is the fact that she's been reversed repeatedly in her judgments. She's only been on the D.C. circuit for less than a year, so she hasn't really gotten any decisions out there to criticize. But I agree with Andrea. I think that this is not going to be a big story unless someone does something dumb and puts their foot in their mouth, which, has happened
It's
in
the
the
United
history.
States Senate.
I was about to say, it has happened in the history of the world, but I think it's very unlikely.
All right, I want to pivot to somewhat of a sidebar story of what we're seeing here with Putin and Ukraine, and that is this cabal on the right that seems to like Putin. And it's led mostly, look, even former President Trump, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, all comfortably calling him shrewd and smart. Take a listen.
The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. Dumb. So dumb.
Very shrewd, very capable. I have enormous respect for him.
Look, he is scrambled now, and he's not alone. It's been interesting to watch. Whoa! All of a sudden, all these Putin lovers are realizing, oh, I bought the propaganda.
Well, and Republicans with whom I spoke are just so frustrated because they say this is a moment where we could talk about the strength of the Republican Party when it comes to foreign policy. And now it's a missed opportunity because you have the headlines of Trump and Pompeo praising Putin. And so they're scratching their heads. They're trying to turn the page. By the way, former President Trump was one of the few people at CPAC who talked about Putin because everyone else there wanted to ignore the fact that he had made this controversial comment.
Back to Helsinki, we were there, Christian and I sitting next to each other, and President Trump defended Putin's take on 2016 and disagreed with his own head of national security, which led to the DNI contradicting him in real time.
Because I covered former President Trump. He likes strongmen, remember? And so this is something that we saw consistently throughout his presidency, Danny.
It is. I think President Trump's judgment on Russia and on Putin has not been awesome. I think Mike Pompeo, Andrea, but I don't think that's what he believes. I'm the only Republican sitting here. Hang on a second.
We're not Republicans, we're Democrats, we're journalists.
Well, 3 of us.
I'm not going to touch that baby. What I'm trying to say here is that I think that there's a missed opportunity, as you say, largely because of these stupid statements, and because there's so much that Republicans can do in Congress. We've seen Republicans push for much stronger sanctions than the Democrats have pushed for. Push on President Biden for a larger supplemental. Ask him why he wasn't prepared. If you knew what was coming, why didn't you prepare?
That's all fair criticism. But let me just say about Mike Pompeo, he is so eager to get to the right of Ted Cruz and other 2024 wannabes that to embrace Putin and align himself with Trump on that just shows that he doesn't believe it. Okay, he's a smart guy. He's a West Point guy.
It's also dangerous.
People have enough judgment to see that when someone says something like that, you can't unhear it.
Yeah,
I can't speak for every voter, but
it's being used by Russian propaganda.
If one of these people would be president today,
Putin would have much more of a field day than he's even having. The NATO alliance would be fractured if Donald Trump were
Jeremy,
president.
that is absolutely untrue. And there is a poll that just came out.
That's not true at
I'm
all.
sorry. I couldn't disagree with you more.
under Trump.
Pompeo has not figured
God,
out.
Danny, you know
how
better
to-
than that.
I actually do know better than that,
But
Andrea.
Pompeo has not figured out how to answer for why he said it in the first place. And if he,
What we're talking about is national
It's
security.
dangerous when it's on Russian television.
Yes,
Going to be a new political world that we live in now going forward, and where security in Europe is going to be a huge issue. We'll see you next week.